France. 1763. A young aristocrat is arrested by royal order. No trial, no charges read in open court, no jury. Just a letter de cachet, signed by the king. A document that could imprison any person in France indefinitely, for any reason, with no legal recourse whatsoever. The man holding this letter was 23 years old. His name was Donatien Alphonse François, Marquis de Sade, and the French government would spend the next 5 decades trying, and failing, to make him disappear. Part 1. The Making of a Problem. To understand why the most powerful monarchy in Europe became obsessed with destroying one man, you need to understand what kind of man he was. De Sade was born in 1740 into one of the oldest aristocratic families in France. His father was a diplomat. His mother was a lady-in-waiting to the royal family. He was educated by Jesuits, served as a cavalry officer, and by his mid-20s had a wife from a respectable noble family, and every advantage that 18th century French society could offer. He threw all of it away, not gradually, not reluctantly, with apparent enthusiasm. His behavior scandalized a court that was not easily scandalized. In an era when French aristocracy conducted its excesses with a certain theatrical discretion, affairs conducted, cruelties exercised, pleasures pursued, all behind the appropriate closed doors, de Sade refused discretion. He was violent. He was reckless. He targeted people who had no power to protect themselves. And when confronted with the consequences, he seemed genuinely incapable of understanding why any of it should stop. The details of his actual crimes are not in dispute. The records survive. The testimonies of victims are documented. What is more complicated, and what would define the rest of his life, was the response of the French state to what he represented. Because de Sade was not simply a violent aristocrat, of which France had many. He was a violent aristocrat who wrote. Part 2. The prison years begin. His first imprisonment came in 1763. 15 days for conduct that the records describe with careful vagueness as offences against religion and public decency. He was released. He continued. In 1768 came the incident that sealed his fate with the authorities, an assault on a woman named Rose Keller that resulted in injuries serious enough to require documented medical examination. He was arrested, briefly imprisoned, released through the intervention of his powerful family. He continued. In 1772, an incident in Marseille involving multiple victims and accusations serious enough that de Sade fled France entirely. He was tried in absentia, convicted, sentenced to death. He was arrested at the border of Savoy and imprisoned in the fortress of Miolans. He escaped through a window at night, lowering himself on improvised rope. Within months, he had returned to his estate at Lacoste and resumed his life as if the death sentence hanging over him in 2 jurisdictions was a minor administrative inconvenience. The French authorities were, by this point, dealing with something they had not anticipated. A man who could not be frightened into compliance. Part 3. The Bastille. In 1778, de Sade was finally brought back to France under arrest, and his death sentence was annulled, replaced with indefinite imprisonment. He was held at Vincennes Castle, then transferred to the Bastille, the ancient royal fortress in the heart of Paris, symbol of absolute royal power, where the king's most inconvenient subjects were stored until they were forgotten. De Sade was not forgotten, and he was not silent. In his cell in the Bastille, he wrote obsessively, compulsively, with the focused productivity of a man who understood that writing was the only power left to him. He produced plays, novels, philosophical treatises, letters of extraordinary intelligence and bitterness. The texts were smuggled out. They circulated. They were read, first in private, then more widely, passed hand to hand through a Paris that was becoming increasingly restless with its rulers. The authorities confiscated manuscripts. He wrote more. They threatened worse conditions. He wrote more. He was in the Bastille when the revolution that would change everything was already gathering in the streets below. Part 4. 10 days before the storm. July 1789. Paris was on the edge of something no one could yet name. The city hummed with a fury that felt like the weeks before a thunderstorm. Everything charged, everything waiting. De Sade had been in the Bastille for 6 years. From his cell window, he could hear the crowds gathering in the streets below. He had a homemade megaphone, constructed from a tube used to empty his chamber pot, and he used it to shout into the crowd. He screamed that prisoners were being murdered inside the Bastille, that the guards were cutting throats, that the people should come and see for themselves. It was not entirely true, but it was not entirely false either. The prison authorities, panicked by what this meant, transferred him out of the Bastille on emergency orders, July 4th, 1789. 10 days later, on July 14th, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille. De Sade was not there to see it. His manuscripts were. When the fortress was taken and searched, his papers, years of writing, texts he had described as his most important work, were found and destroyed in the chaos. He would later say that the loss of those manuscripts caused him more grief than anything else in his life, including every year he had spent imprisoned. Part 5. Revolution. The revolution freed him. At 49 years old, after 13 years of imprisonment, Donatien de Sade walked out of confinement into a France that was dismantling everything he had grown up with. He embraced it completely. He renounced his aristocratic title. He called himself Citizen Sade. He became a minor functionary of the revolutionary government, and then a judge on a local tribunal responsible for deciding who lived and who died in the terror. What happened next was the most unexpected chapter of an unexpected life. He refused to sign death warrants. The man whose writings had shocked civilized France with their violence, whose name had become synonymous with cruelty, sat on a revolutionary tribunal and declined repeatedly to send people to the guillotine. He declared that judicial murder was still murder regardless of what government authorized it. He was arrested, accused of being a moderate in revolutionary France, a potentially fatal charge. He came within a handful of days of the guillotine himself. He survived the terror by chance, by a bureaucratic delay, by the fall of Robespierre arriving just in time. When the killing stopped, he walked free again. Part 6. Napoleon. The revolution faded. The Republic became a consulate. The consulate became an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte looked at France and began putting it back in order, which meant, among other things, identifying the elements that order could not accommodate. De Sade's books had been published during the revolutionary years, most famously Justine, which appeared in 1791, and its successor, Juliette. They were read across Europe. They were translated. They caused outrage in every capital that encountered them. Napoleon read reports about them. In 1801, police raided the publisher's office and found de Sade there, correcting the proofs of a new work. He was arrested on the spot, not charged, not tried, simply taken. Napoleon's government was direct about its reasoning. De Sade could not be prosecuted through normal legal channels because his books, however offensive, had not technically broken any specific law. So he was committed to the psychiatric hospital at Charenton, declared insane, institutionalized, removed from society through a mechanism that required no trial and produced no verdict. He was 61 years old. Part 7. Charenton. Charenton was not, by the standards of its time, a brutal institution. The director, a man named Abbé de Coulmiers, was relatively enlightened. He allowed de Sade privileges that most inmates did not have. He permitted him to stage theatrical productions using the hospital's patients as actors, with audiences drawn from Parisian society who came to watch lunatics perform plays written by the most notorious man in France. It was bizarre. It was degrading. It was also, in its way, de Sade continuing to do the only thing he had ever consistently done. He wrote, he produced, he performed. His companion of many years, a young woman named Marie Constance Quesnay, was permitted to live at Charenton with him. She had been with him for years, had stayed when others left, and she remained. He was 74 years old when he died at Charenton, on December 2nd, 1814. His will specified that his grave should be planted with acorns so that a forest would eventually cover it, and his name would disappear from the earth. The authorities ignored this request. His skull was later exhumed and examined by a phrenologist who declared, on the basis of its shape, that de Sade had possessed the skull of a kindly man. Epilogue. The French state spent 50 years trying to silence the Marquis de Sade. They imprisoned him in royal fortresses, revolutionary jails, and Napoleonic psychiatric institutions. They destroyed his manuscripts. They burned his books. They committed him without trial under 3 separate governments, a monarchy, a republic, and an empire, each of which found its own justification for doing what all 3 fundamentally wanted: to make him stop. He never stopped. The books they burned were reprinted. The manuscripts they destroyed were partially reconstructed from memory and copies. The ideas they found intolerable survived in the work of writers, philosophers, and psychologists for the next 2 centuries. The word sadism, derived from his name, entered every major language on earth. The man himself remained in a cell, but the ideas were loose, and no lettre de cachet ever written could put them back.